Okay, let's look at the next question. So this is a conditional. Line 1 is a conditional here. Do we have the negation of the consequent of that conditional? Yes. A or B is the negation of not A or B. And not A or B is the negation of A or B. Likewise, not Z is the negation of Z, and Z is the negation of not Z. So having or missing a tilde makes a thing a negation of another thing. So we do have the negation of the consequent, and then we have inferred the negation of the antecedent. So this fits the rule. This is an example of modus tollens. What about this one? Well, just like above, modus tollens only applies if the main operator is a horseshoe. It does not apply to parts of lines. So even though this looks like modus tollens, it doesn't apply because it has to be on its own line. If you do a truth table for this, you will see that this is an invalid argument. Our rules guarantee that if you apply them to something that's true, you are guaranteed to get something that's true. But it's possible, like if we were allowed to derive this, if we had a rule that said we could derive this from this, we would be able to derive something false from something true. But our rules would never let that happen. Okay, how about the disjunctive syllogism rule? This rule says that if you have a disjunction on a line, and you have the negation of one of the disjuncts on another line, then you can infer the other disjunct, the leftover one. So that's like saying if I have a cat or a dog, I don't have a cat, therefore I do have a dog, right? So which of these fit that pattern? Here we have a disjunction. Do we have the negation of either of the disjuncts? Yes, this is the negation of this. Did we put the other disjunct on the new line, or did we conclude the other disjunct exactly as it is? Yes, this fits disjunctive syllogism. Next, we have a disjunction on a line. Check. Again, we have the negation of one disjunct. Check. But what we should put on the other line is the leftover disjunct, right? This should be not X, but instead we've concluded the negation of the other disjunct. This is not an example of disjunctive syllogism. This would be like reasoning, I have either a cat or a dog. I don't have a cat, therefore I don't have a dog. Doesn't make sense, right? So this is not an example, and if you were to do a truth table, you would see that it's invalid. How about this one? We have a disjunction. We have the negation of a disjunct. P is just as much the negation of not P as not P is P. And we've concluded the remaining disjunct. So this or this, not this, therefore this. This is an example of disjunctive syllogism. Last but not least, we've got this one here. We have a disjunction that's part of the conditional here. It's the consequent of a conditional, but our rule doesn't apply to parts of lines. The disjunction has to be the main operator. So this one is not going to be a case of disjunctive syllogism. Okay, so let's do some proofs together. And again, we've got formatting rules here. Be sure to follow those for the remaining. There's 3 proofs. So strategy-wise, how do you get started? These are all short proofs, and so we don't need a whole lot of strategy, but just as a general suggestion, there are 2 main strategies for figuring out what to do when you get started. Excuse me. Strategy number 1 is to just do anything you can see. How do you get started with that plan? Well, start by finding the main operator of a statement. Here we've got a disjunction, and ask yourself, what rules apply to disjunctions? Disjunctive syllogism. Do I have the negation of either disjunct? Oh, I do, so there's immediately a thing I can do. Going to the next proof, I see there's a conditional. I have 2 rules that apply to conditionals. Here's 2 conditionals. Maybe it's one of the conditions. So just kind of look at what do you have to work with and what rules apply, right? The other thing you can do is work backwards. So I know that I'm trying to get x as the last line of my proof. So I know that that's going to be x. And my question is, how do I get it? And I'll immediately look at the premises. Where is x in my premises? It is part of a conditional. It's the consequent of a conditional that is wrapped up in a disjunction. Now I know that I have a rule that allows me to derive the consequent of a conditional, but only if I have this on its own line. So I want to get this on its own line. This is part of a disjunction. How do I get part of a disjunction on its own line? Well, if I have the negation of the other disjunct, I can. Oh, I do. I can get started, right? So you can work backwards strategically, or you could just do things you see. And for short proofs, the former rule will be fine. So let's get started again. Just do things we see. I see that I have a disjunction. What rules apply to disjunctions? The DS rule. So do I have the negation of either disjunct? I do. So that means I can put the other one, and I'm just going to copy and paste it, on its own line. But always remove the spaces when you copy and paste. Now, how did I get that? I used the DS rule on lines 1 and 2. So I'm going to cite lines 1 and 2, and I'm going to put DS. Okay, now, if these are true, and I've accurately derived this, then this will be true as well. So I have a new thing I can work with. I now have a conditional. What rules apply to conditionals? Both modus ponens and modus tollens. If modus tollens applies, I would need the negation of the consequent. Do I have not x? No, so it doesn't apply. For modus ponens, I would need the antecedent. Do I have q on its own line? I do, here. So if I have a conditional, and I have the antecedent of that conditional on a line, I can put the consequent on a line. I can derive x. And I will justify my doing that by citing the lines I looked at, 3 and 4, and the rule that I used to do it, which is modus ponens. Okay, let's look at the next one. I have a conditional and 2 negated statements. I'm trying to get A. I know this is going to be A eventually. But let's just start with, what's the main operator? I have a conditional. Which rules apply to conditionals? Modus ponens and modus tollens. Modus ponens says, if you have the antecedent on its own line, then you can derive the consequent. So that would mean I would need this whole thing on its own line. Do I have not A or B? No, so that rule does not apply. Modus tollens says, if you have the negation of the consequent on its own line, you can derive the negation of the antecedent. I have not C, that's the negation of C. So I can derive the negation of this. So I'm just going to copy and paste. So this was the actual antecedent, but I want the negation. And negating is either adding or removing a tilde. So I'm going to remove it. But now this has unnecessary parentheses. The only reason for these parentheses is to make it clear that the negation applies to the whole disjunction. So now I'm going to remove any unnecessary parentheses, and I'm going to remove spaces. So this is just A or B. And I'm going to justify that with lines 1 and 2, modus tollens. Now I have a disjunction to work with. I have a rule that applies to disjunctions. It says if I have a disjunction and I have the negation of either disjunct, then I can put the other one on a line. So I've got A or B. Do I have the negation of either of these? Yes. Here's not B. So I can put A on a line. And that's what I was ultimately trying to do. I will cite lines 3 and 4, and I use the rule DS. Okay, let's do the last one. So let's just look at what I have to work with. 2 conditionals. I have rules that apply to conditionals, modus ponens and modus tollens. So let's start with this one. Do I have Z? That's what I would need to use modus ponens. No, so it doesn't apply. To use modus tollens, I would need the negation of this. So I would either need not Q, or I would need just plain Q. Do I have that? No. So I can't do anything with line 3. Here's another conditional. If I were going to use modus tollens, I would need the negation of this whole thing on its own line. Do I have that? No. So modus tollens does not apply. If modus ponens applies, I should have the antecedent on its own line. Do I? Yes, I do. So that means I can put the consequent on its own line. Now I'm going to remove parentheses because they aren't helping to disambiguate anything, and I'm going to remove the spaces. Now I can cite the lines I looked at, lines 1 and 2, the rule that I used, modus tollens. Okay, so I have a new thing to work with. I already said I couldn't use this one. Did I end up getting either Z or Q? No, so I still can't use it. But I have this new thing to work with, so let's focus on that. It's a disjunction. The rule I have that applies to disjunctions is disjunctive syllogism. That says I would need the negation of one or the other of the disjuncts. So I would either need not Q or I would need P, or alternatively not Q, or not P. I have P. P is the negation of not P. So this is something I can apply the DS rule to, and I can put the other disjunct, whatever it is, on its own line using the DS rule. And I'm going to cite lines 1 and 4, and I'm going to cite the rule that I used to get that Q. Now, notice that we used P twice. Nothing wrong with that. You can derive things from the same premises. The only rules are you have to use the rules that you're given and apply them correctly, and the last line has to be the conclusion. That's all. Those are the only constraints on a complete, accurate proof. Use the rules correctly, get the conclusion on a line. And you can reuse premises. There are all kinds of other little quirks that might come up, but for the most part, if we haven't said you can't do it, you can. Okay, so we're ultimately trying to get the conclusion. We know it's going to be not Z because that's always our last line, but how do we get it? Well, I have this new thing to work with, Q. We have a premise we haven't used. You don't have to use all the premises. That's not a part of the rules. The rules are just apply the rules accurately and derive the conclusion on the last line. But oftentimes the premises aren't there for no reason. So what can I do with this? It is a conditional. Have I yet gotten the antecedent? Do I have Z anywhere? No. But do I have the negation of the consequent? I do. That's what I derived. So now I can use modus tollens to get not Z. I will cite lines 3 and 5 and the rule that I used, which is modus tollens. Oh, up here I must have said one thing and done another, because this is definitely modus ponens. We used the antecedent and we derived the consequent, and that is modus ponens. So if I said one thing and wrote another, I apologize profusely. Okay, so again, we removed spaces. We put all of our lines in numerical order with no spaces and just a parentheses. We used the acronyms for our rules, and we didn't include any unnecessary parentheses. So these are correct. Okay, advice. When you're completing the homework, when you're taking a quiz, when you're doing the online homework, write stuff down with pen and paper. Here, just transcribe the proof. Make sure you transcribe it correctly, but they're pretty short. It's not like copying down a huge truth table. It's just a couple of letters. So transcribe it, do it with pen and paper. Print out the practice exercises, not the required homework ones, but all of the practice ones. They're printer-friendly worksheets. Print those out, or if you don't have a printer, transcribe them. They're not that long. Do this stuff with pen and paper, and do a lot of it. To master this material, most people are going to have to practice more than what is required in the homework. And as I advised at the beginning of part 1 of this video series, you should work at the level that's appropriate to you. If you are feeling frustrated, you need to do easier problems. If you are doing the easiest problems that are available and you feel frustrated, you need to reach out for help. But if you are doing problems and they're super easy, you need to give yourself harder problems. So do lots of practice and practice at the level that's appropriate for you. All right, advice received. Save and submit, and let's see if we got them all right. Eight out of 8. And somehow 100 hours lapsed. That is not accurate. That's weird. Hopefully it's some weird quirk of being in student mode. So when you submit solutions, I did put the